Adolf Hitler is dead. The Red Army is rejoicing despite losing around 18 million people. The UK and the US are already discussing the perils of communism. As many as 85 million people have died during 6 years and 1 day of bloody fighting. But it's not over just yet. Japan is still fighting, and it isn't looking like the country will surrender. As you know, 2 bombs fixed that problem. But what if they hadn't been dropped? That's what we'll find out today. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945. People took to the streets, waving handkerchiefs in the air and shouting about peace on earth. Flags and banners lined the streets of Britain when Winston Churchill made one of his moving speeches. My dear friends, this is your hour. This is not victory of a party or of any class. It is a victory of the great British nation as a whole. We were the first in this ancient island to draw the sword against tyranny. People never gave up, Churchill said. They believed that they could win and release themselves from what he said was the jaws of death and the mouth of hell. Despite Britain coming out of the war with tremendous empire-ruining debts to the USA, Churchill talked fondly about the nation across that so-called pond. We must turn ourselves to fulfill our duty to our own countrymen and to our gallant allies of the United States, who were so foully and treacherously attacked by Japan. We will go hand in hand with them. Even if it is a hard struggle, we will not be the ones who will fail. Churchill reminded the world who the evildoers were and then talked about what he called the overwhelming power of the USA. He told people that the war wasn't over. More death and destruction were on the way. He said, "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toil and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued. The injury she has inflicted on Great Britain, the United States, and other countries, and her detestable cruelties call for justice and retribution." As you know, justice and retribution manifested as 2 bombs named Fat Man and Little Boy dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, these 2 destroyers of worlds left Japan in a state of shock. Some parts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were left a barren wasteland. Entire families were almost vaporized in their wooden houses. Playgrounds were reduced to ashes. Survivors were left with terrible burns. The world had never seen anything like it. These survivors, the hibakusha, sought medical care, but supplies were low, and many of the medical staff in the area were either dead or close to it. Much of the rest of the world celebrated when on September 2, 1945, Japan surrendered. 418,500 Americans were dead. As many as 230,000 Japanese people died because of those bombs, and somewhere between 2.6 and 3.1 million Japanese soldiers and civilians lost their lives in the war. The country was down on its knees. The feeling of shame pervaded every household and military office. People sat in their living rooms, tears spilling from their eyes, as Emperor Hirohito told them it was over. Part of his speech went, "The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it would also lead to the total extinction of human civilization." At that same time, U.S. President Harry Truman told his people that a mighty threat to civilization had been laid to rest. He said the evil done by the Japanese warlords can never be repaired or forgotten, but their power to destroy and kill has been taken from them. They were impotent, he said, their wings clipped, their dreams had been disfigured. Since Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, it had inflicted misery upon misery on the American people. But now the winner, said Truman, was liberty, the freedom of the individual, and the personal dignity of man. You can be sure that many Americans weren't overly upset about the destruction and loss of life those bombs caused. Most didn't criticize the powers that be over the decision to use them. In 1945, the approval rating for using them was 85%. Only 29% of Americans said the bombing was unjustified. 64% of Japanese people said the wholesale murder was unwarranted. If you look at polls today, you'll find some big differences. Now, only about half of Americans say Japan had to be bombed with the nukes. It seems over the decades, fewer and fewer people have endorsed the use of those bombs. In fact, many Americans today will tell you that laying waste to 2 Japanese cities with those most atrocious of inventions was disgusting. You'll find plenty of people that hate war and violence. They despise the vicissitudes of politics that make wars possible and send mainly poor people to an early grave. They will not defend war in general, and they will be the first to let you know that the imperialist nature of some nations is a blight on the human race. Still, these same people will also tell you that Little Man and Fat Boy's mess was a necessary evil. Lest we forget, let us remind you what was going on at the end of World War II. And please be reminded in this caveat that trying to understand the use of nuclear weapons is not the same as outright endorsing atomic warfare. Japan had committed untold atrocities. What happened in China can only be described as gruesome. The human experimentation at the secret Unit 731 was beyond horrific. POWs were suffering in the internment camps, and this was mostly all behind the scenes, a kind of underground war that was going on. Japan thought it was fighting for its way of life. Like Hitler, the country believed that the Western world was destroying the planet. A new order had to be established, one which Japan thought it was capable of leading, in Asia at least. So the people of Japan clung to this belief in their superiority. It was an ideological war, and so they were willing to fight to the bitter end. This is perhaps no better exemplified than by the kamikaze pilots, who purposefully crashed their planes into American ships. For the US soldiers who witnessed it, it wasn't just petrifying, but it showed them they were fighting against impenetrable wills, so single-minded and stubborn that they'd fight to the very last man. We'll return to this because it's an essential element of the story. Weapons and strategy are one thing, but the will of a people is another. This will was evident on July 6, 1944, when Japan launched what was a futile charge, a human wave attack that the Allies called a banzai attack. Japanese troops ran into bullets on an island in the Marianas, some of them armed with only shovels and sticks. About 3,000 men were in the charge and most of them died. A US soldier later said it was like a cattle stampede. He added, "They just kept coming and coming. I thought they'd never stop." Some of those lying on the ground with bullets in their chests invited the Americans to go over to them, grenades hidden in their hands. They outright refused to become prisoners to what they believed was American scum. When the Third Reich fell, Japan just buckled down even more. Britain and its colonies were now winning the war from the Pacific, with the last days of the campaign in Burma costing the Allies a few hundred lives compared to the tens of thousands of Japanese lives lost in the futile defense. Major General Curtis LeMay of the American Air Force led an attack on the Japanese mainland, mainly possible because the Americans had now taken islands close enough to the Axis power to make bombing campaigns possible. On March 9, 1945, he ordered an air raid on Tokyo, consisting of 325 B-29 Superfortress bombers. Only 12 of them were shot down. Tokyo was turned into a hellscape. The Americans wanted blood. They knew they'd be killing civilians. Today, that would be a war crime, but they thought that if Tokyo was lit up, the Japanese would finally back down. They were dead wrong. Everywhere you looked, there were burned-out cars and stacks of charred bodies, women and children lying in the streets. It was total carnage. It was highly unethical, but it didn't change how the Japanese felt about surrendering. The Americans were in no mood for a compromise. They lost 7,184 of their men in battle to secure the island of Iwo Jima. 12,500 American troops died in the Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese generals didn't think the Americans could stand much more. They knew they'd lose far more men, far more civilians, but they'd bet that the Americans would negotiate when they realized asking Japan to surrender was futile. On the waves, Japanese kamikaze pilots were raising hell. After all, they rarely missed their target. Commander Stephen Jurica of the USS Franklin said it was blood-curdling out in the ocean. He said, "I saw destroyers get hit, burst into flames, men jumping over the side to avoid the flames. Japan was bleeding too, but the attacks did not stop." One US pilot said the Tokyo raid looked like Dante's Inferno. The attacks just kept coming, one after another, and the bodies kept piling up. The Americans then hit Kobe. One night, they destroyed around 300,000 homes in Osaka, killing thousands of civilians. This wasn't just a war, it was a massacre. It was ordinary families paying the price. For every American bomber that went up, about 100 Japanese civilians died. It was clear what was happening. The US was punishing Japan for its past aggression. The US soldiers kept wondering when all this mayhem would finally stop. Japan had lost, they thought, so why did they keep coming at us? How can they send planes crashing into our ships? A commander named Fitzhugh Lee said life on the high seas with those kamikaze pilots was not very comfortable at all. He recalled, "It was interesting psychologically, my first experience of real fear, being in the face of what you thought might be death at any moment." Letters home suggested that the Japanese troops would never stop. One guy, Hayashi Inchiso, wrote to his parents saying, "All men born in Japan are destined to die fighting for their country. You have done a splendid job raising me to become an honorable man. I will do a splendid job sinking an enemy aircraft carrier. Do brag about me." He, like many Japanese, hated the Americans. Of course, he didn't even know any Americans, but such was the power of propaganda. Like in all nations, the owners of industry and the people of great wealth could see past the propaganda, but the pawns on the chessboard of war could not. It might be hard for you to comprehend, but what the Americans were for the Japanese, Hitler was to the Americans. Japanese civilians believed the Americans were the boogeyman, there to upset their culture and enslave them to a decadent culture. This is why they wouldn't stop. All civilians heard all day on the radio were stories of the beast coming to destroy their way of life. These people put their hands on their hearts and promised never to submit. Back in the US, roundtable meetings were being held to discuss the use of the atomic bomb. From July 14th to July 16th, a meeting was held by none other than Robert Oppenheimer, the so-called father of the atomic bomb. At the end of the meeting, he declared that some people were against using the bomb and that it would make the world prejudiced against the US. He added, others emphasized the opportunity of saving American lives by immediate military use and believe that such will improve international prospects. Some leaders just didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Some thought that Japan would fight on even if the bombs were dropped. Some knew what would happen, but said there was no alternative. That becomes more understandable when you hear what General Yoshiro Umezu said in a newspaper that was published May 1945. He wrote, "The sure path to victory in a decisive battle lies in uniting the resources of the empire behind the war effort and in mobilizing the full strength of the nation." He finished by saying it was still possible to annihilate the American invaders. Japan was being bust up. So many people were now homeless, their loved ones lying deep in the ground. Their houses were still burning when the people heard that the war was far from over, and if the people just tried, the American devils could still be beaten. In June, Major Yoshitaka Hori delivered a speech to Army cadets, warning them of losing the will to fight. He told the cadets officer that when he speaks to them, he must end on a high note, assuring them the Japanese Imperial Army is still in the fighting mood. So, do you really think Japan was ready to surrender? Some Japanese politicians actually wanted to. Some parts of the public did, but not the generals. The generals were still gung-ho about kicking America's butt. For sure, dropping those bombs was an awful thing to do, but just as we can blame Hitler for putting Germans through hell, we can blame the Japanese generals for causing needless deaths. Many Americans in the know, including Truman, believed the bombs were the only way of sparing lives. Soon, a plane named Enola Gay was rolling through Tinian in the recently captured Mariana Islands. Some of the younger soldiers rightly pointed out that this B-29 bomber didn't look like the other ones. It'd been modified. They had no idea why, but they knew something was different, and that something important was happening. A 19-year-old soldier was brave enough to ask what was going on with the plane, and when he asked why it was there, he was told that the Americans were about to win the war. There was a breathless excitement around the place, but very few people knew what was actually about to go down. The Japanese were still dogged when they were about to get hit by the most powerful weapons in the world. The Soviets were about to march into Manchuria, 1.5 million troops walking alongside 5,500 tanks. The Soviets, perhaps understandably, would not be friendly to their captives in Manchuria. 300,000 Japanese POWs were about to die there. In Japan's burned-out cities, families were still proudly saying that Japanese men never surrender. Some still held on to the slogan, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die and leave no ignominious crime behind you." Now their beliefs were going to be tested like never before. The US, now easily the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, as one military man later pointed out, was about to cease being innocent and good without qualification. Boom, boom. Before we start part 2 of this show, we'll let you listen to the words of a British writer, the famous Charles Dickens of Oliver Twist fame. In his book on the French Revolution called A Tale of Two Cities, there are some rather wise words at the beginning. They are related to what was going on in France, but they work just as well for the end of World War II. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. This sums up what happened in Japan. The Americans knew Japan wouldn't give up the fight, otherwise they wouldn't have used the atomic bombs. But as you know, many people were against employing world-wrecking high-tech bombs. That's why a land invasion had been planned, involving mostly the US but also the UK and other allies. The invasion was called Operation Downfall, which would have cost many, many lives because you can bet that Japan would have thrown everything at the Americans. It consisted of 2 main attacks, one called Operation Olympic and the other Operation Coronet. In November 1945, through Operation Olympic, the US intended to take the island of Kyushu. It had just captured the island of Okinawa in a bloody fight, and so the US could launch further attacks from these islands. You must remember that capturing Okinawa had been no walk in the park. The 82-day conflict was brutal for all involved. That's why the Japanese named it the Violent Wind of Steel. More lives were lost in this battle than any other in the Pacific, with the Japanese losing in the region of 120,000 men and the US around 12,000. These were just the military casualties too. The Japanese had their local men and women dress up in uniform and equip them with a gun. For some, this would be the first time they shot a weapon. It's thought that just about half of the 300,000 folks that lived on that island perished. Some of them were just kids. It was a bloodbath. But as you know, the majority of Japanese people thought that their way of life was under threat from a greedy, catastrophically consumerist nation which put little value on respecting social order. A U.S. Naval Vice Admiral couldn't have put it better when he said, "There was a hypnotic fascination to the sight so alien to our Western philosophy. We watched each plunging kamikaze with the detached horror of one witnessing a terrible spectacle rather than as the intended victim. We forgot self for a moment as we groped hopelessly for the thought of that other man up there." Again, we can't say enough about the Japanese mindset and how it was different from the American mindset. It reminds us of some things Colonel Kurtz said in the movie Apocalypse Now. Kurtz recalls just how far the enemy would go to win, which included chopping off the arms of the recently inoculated, its own people. Kurtz knows that if you have soldiers that are willing to do anything, you can beat anything. He says, "And I realized, like I was shot with a diamond bullet right through my forehead. And I thought, my God, the genius of that, the genius. The will to do that, perfect, genuine, complete, crystalline, pure." He said the men fought with their full hearts, more than any American was capable of. Men whose hearts were still partly back home with their lovers and apple pie. Kurtz said, "You have to have men who are moral and at the same time who are able to utilize their primordial instincts to kill without feeling, without passion, without judgment." Oh, the horror. And when those American soldiers saw the Japanese kamikaze pilots flying at them, and they saw children gritting their teeth as they ran to gunfire, all seeming so normal to them, they knew they could never do the same. Their moral judgment precluded that. The Japanese were not monsters, but they were willing to fight in a way many Americans would not have been able to, with a totally impervious will. With that in mind, how do you think Operation Downfall would have gone down? We should say again, with other allies involved, while the Americans were distrustful of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union was there to offer help, as were the Brits and their Commonwealth countries, just as soon as they could get enough troops over there. The Americans alone would send around 450,000 troops for the invasion of Kyushu, but intelligence said the Japanese had around 600,000 troops ready to protect the island. That number would have likely increased to 900,000, all of them more than willing to fight to the death. All over the island, they had hidden machine gun positions. They also had booby traps all over the place. They had pilots at the ready who were willing to fly into American ships and troops. This was already arranged in a defense plan called Operation Ketsugo. Still, the Americans would have deployed just about every bomber they had. Scores of B-29s, B-17s, and B-24s would have filled the sky. Battleships would have filled the ocean. Back on the island, the Japanese would have been coming in waves, banzai, and the Americans would have kept shooting them down, all the time wondering how these men could just keep coming. Like automatons programmed to destroy, the Japanese would not have stopped. This battle would have been much worse than in Okinawa, and the Americans would have taken the island eventually. But by God, there would have been a lot of casualties. We say this without speculating what mayhem the Pacific Typhoon would have caused. And this would have just been the start. With the British on site, we can compare it to the invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord. Still, Operation Downfall would have been vastly bigger in terms of manpower, arms, and the buckets of blood that would have seeped into the soil. Japan wouldn't have been able to get all of its troops out of China and Manchuria, but you can be sure the entire available military plus citizens would have been thrown at the Americans and British. After all, this was to save the country. France would have been nothing in comparison. Millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians would have fought against the invasion. To add to that, Japan never successfully had been invaded, and this was a country with a collective mindset. Women would have run at the enemy armed with brooms and wooden spoons. Children would have thrown mud bombs at soldiers. Even the dogs would have joined in. That's a joke before you comment below. Nonetheless, everything rested on Japan defending the first attack on Kyushu. But let's just say the British and American troops were successful. What then? You must now think about some Japanese propaganda that had been embraced for some time. It talked about the glorious death of 100 million and basically said that all Japanese civilians should fight if it came to it. The people were told it was glorious to die for the Holy Emperor of Japan. and every Japanese man, woman, and child should die for the emperor when the Allies arrived. Many of these people really believed that. They told each other that it was better to die than be enslaved by what they called the White Devils. Not that all Allied troops were white by a long way. At the same time, the Japanese had around 10,000 planes left. 2,000 of them would go on kamikaze missions, with the Japanese military commander saying they expected to sink at least 400 American ships. We should say that the U.S. intelligence estimated the Japanese to have over 12,000 aircraft, of which they said half would be kamikazes. The Japanese also had their own fleet of ships from which they could launch attacks, not to mention all their submarines. We might add that they had kamikaze-like ships, too. These were the 3,300 Shinyo boats, each of which was willing to blow itself up when close enough to an American ship. Their navy even had frogmen that were willing to die for the cause. These were the Fukuryu, a very suitable word, it seems. These guys would swim with explosives and blow themselves up when they reached U.S. landing crafts. Okay, so we have a fleet of ships. We have 10,000 planes, 2,000 of which will likely hit their targets when they crash into American ships and landing positions. There would be over 1 million soldiers plus another 28 million volunteer fighting corps. These were men aged 15 to 60 and women aged 17 to 40. 2.4 million people living in Kyushu alone. These were civilians, not soldiers, but they would have joined the fight. A lot of ugliness would have taken place too, with chemical weapons being a mainstay in this invasion. Under the Geneva Protocol, that sort of thing was outlawed, but the Japanese and Americans hadn't bothered to sign it. We should also add that it goes without saying that the 30-odd thousand American POWs would have been slaughtered in camps after the invasion started, along with the Brits and other Allied POWs. Once Kyushu was in the hands of the Allies, they would have gone forward with Operation Coronet, Part 2 of Operation Olympic. This was the invasion of Kanto Plain, not far from Tokyo. And then, wham bam thank you ma'am, the Allies would be running all over Japan. The US 1st Army and 8th Army, with Brits and British Commonwealth at their side, would have stormed the beaches just as they'd done when they were about to take France back from Germany. Then on to Tokyo. Stir for a while, sprinkle on some air raids, add a dash of chemical weapons, and put that in the oven until doomsday. Job done. Here's how the humans destroy millions of precious eggs for an omelet that they never wanted. But not so fast. The devastation that would have happened to get this far is beyond our comprehension. You already know how many Japanese planes and ships would have had to been destroyed to make this happen, and so you know how much damage that would have also caused to the Americans and British. To put it this way, news reports back in the US would have been like reading the diary of the devil. The US forecast that the Battle of Kyushu would have cost about 38,000 American lives. These were people expected to be killed in action, with many more US troops dying of disease. The list of total casualties would have been in the region of 180,000. The War Department said to successfully invade Japan and finally get the emperor down on his knees, 400,000 to 800,000 Americans would have had to die. But with Japanese civilians joining in the war and their houses getting bombed for weeks on end, it was estimated that 5 to 10 million of the total Japanese population would also die in the process. And that was a good chunk of the country. The destruction would have been so monstrous that Japan would have had to build up again from its ruined foundations. American families with collectively around 500,000 lost sons would have been asking why the military didn't use the bombs. Make no mistake, Japan would have lost. How could it fight the power of the US, not to mention the British Navy, the British Task Force, and the RAF, all working alongside the British Commonwealth nations, the Canadians, the Indians, the Australians, and more? Then, if the Soviets attacked, well, Japan wouldn't have had a chance in hell. But as we've seen in other wars, a people that are willing to fight until the end will indubitably lead mass death on a frightening scale. The Allies wouldn't have pulled out, though. The stakes were too high. This was not Vietnam. This was a world war that had to be wrapped up. We can think of no better two words than the horror. Perhaps the epitome of human negligence and human intelligence are weapons we've created to destroy the world. One of our biggest scientific achievements in history is splitting the atom, and we use this achievement to create a destroyer of worlds. Still, maybe without those bombs, there would have been much more carnage in Japan and possibly more world wars decades after. Perhaps those two bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki prevented what would have become a much gorier ending. It's certainly a paradox of human nature that we must create cataclysmic weapons to protect ourselves from ourselves and keep the peace. Now you need to watch What If Russia Launched a Nuclear Bomb minute by minute, or lighten up your day with how Mr. Poop became Japan's most wanted criminal.